Okay, so pointing out that the abstract is due Friday at 11:59. So what is the abstract over? The abstract is going to be you starting to plan what you're going to do for your term paper. So we're going to start with looking at the term paper. Did I show you guys the term paper on the first day or no? I held off on that. Okay. So the term paper, and this isn't due for a very long time. It is 12 pages, it's worth 75 points, at least this version of it, right? And this essay is your choice to study a specific topic from our class in more detail. For instance, you might be interested in colonialism, you might be interested in genocide, you might be interested in the Black Lives Matter movement, really anything connected to the topic of race and ethnicity. You can either explore the wider literature on a topic, right? So you can keep it pretty broad if you want. If you're interested in exploring more on genocide, you can explore broadly the literature on genocide. Or you can focus in on a very narrow part of it, right? So for instance, studying the symbols used by Black Lives Matters, right, would be an example, right, opposed to just studying the movement itself. The goal is to thoroughly research your topic with the use of scholarly sources. I use a very narrow definition of scholarly sources, meaning that like I only accept the things that in graduate school you would use as scholarly sources, which is only academic journals, books, and primary sources. So by primary sources, I mean like if you're going to write a paper on Black Lives Matter, right? Black Lives Matter's website would be a primary source, right? Because it's Black Lives Matter talking about Black Lives Matters, right? But, like, you know, you can't use newspaper articles, you can't use blog sites, you can't use all these things that may be considered academic sources at a normal undergrad level that you would like learn from the library. Our primary sources or our legitimate sources. Because a lot of times you wouldn't be allowed to use those if you were further along in your education. I just think that teaching people to do one thing at one level and telling them it's wrong later is kind of obnoxious. So instead I try to get you guys in the habit of using.
If you were to like interview someone, would you count that as like a source, or would that just like on the side?
That would be a primary source. So you could interview somebody, yeah. But you'll have to be very careful with it when you interview somebody, like they don't represent anything larger than their own opinion, right? So like, they're a part of the discourse, you can use them, but like, you can't extrapolate it out. So like, if you have one person who went to a protest movement once, they can tell you about their experience of a protest movement, but they can't represent the whole group. Does that make sense? Okay. If you have any more questions about that, you can. Why, just out of curiosity, who are you thinking about interviewing?
I haven't like decided like who yet, but like,
Yeah.
I don't know yet.
Oh, okay, yeah, that's okay. I didn't mean to put you on the spot. That was just literally my curiosity. So you should be using these sources, but you should also try to apply one or more of the theories we actually talk about in class. And it's okay to pick a topic now and decide what you're going to use from class, because we're going to cover a lot of ground between now and when you actually write. So you don't, like, right now you're just starting to explore, right? So, okay, the abstract. Has anybody ever done an abstract before? Cool. So abstracts are short statements, basically, of what you're going to research. So an abstract is 150 to 250 words. So that's very small, right? Like, it's basically a nice meaty paragraph is an abstract. And all that you're doing is you briefly explain your current research. It's commonly used for like, so if you were to go present at a conference, a lot of times you would send them something before you've even done the research, right? You have some idea of what you're going to do, but you're not necessarily done. Actually, often when professionals go to conferences, they haven't even written the papers yet that they're presenting on, because they're trying to get feedback from people. Right? So when you send an abstract, it's like the first thing you write is your abstract, right? This is what I'm going to do. And you may tweak it as time goes on, right? But that's essentially, it's this one little paragraph, right, where you where you're writing what you're thinking of exploring. So like what I'm looking for you to do for this week is kind of think about what you want to explore, what question you kind of want to figure out, what question you kind of want to answer with your paper, right? And then post that in a paragraph to me, right, by the end of the week. Does it make sense? Cool. And you can actually use the abstract, and this is how you'd usually use it. Does anybody know familiar with an abstract in a different context, like particularly if you're reading something? Journal articles often start with an abstract at the top, right? That little paragraph. So essentially that's how that starts, right? People write that before they even start their project usually. In fact, like they'll tweak it to fit if they change their project. But so at the end of when you have your term paper, you can actually just take this abstract, change it a little, and use it as the top of your paper. So.
Will this be part of the 12-page requirement, or will it be like something else entirely?
What's that?
Will it count towards like the 12 pages?
Yeah, that'll count towards your actual pages. So you just can essentially be adapted to become your introduction to your topic. So.
When we're looking for like articles for our paper, can we go onto like the Benedictine like libraries?
Yeah, that's the best place to find it.
Okay, and then should we just say like peer review maybe, or like how would we do that?
Yeah. So okay, I'll show you. Let's go to the library website. Okay, so what you're going to do when you go to online databases, and the best one to use is that one. Wait, hold on. That's not the one I actually want. They move them around in order. Go here to eptco-host, right? Hit select all. That's going to get you like the broadest range of stuff, right? Hit continue. So let's say, sticking with the example, search. And so how you're going to figure, so you might want to use books, right? So like if you look at the side here, it'll tell you whether it's a book, right? It'll tell you whether it's a periodical. Periodicals you shouldn't use, right? You can also go over here, show more, academic journals, books, ebooks. You can also use something like dissertations. Government documents would count, so you can use those too. So I hit update. And so you have 1,940 sources on Black Lives Matter. So you generally, like how I'm going to say to go sorting through that, right? Because you're probably going to get a lot more than you want. There's two ways you can go about it. You can get more narrow in what you're talking about. So Black Lives Matter, and let's say symbols, and see if anything pops up. So here we get some discussion, right, of something like that, right? So essentially you can just play around with searching. Or the other thing you can do is just keep it as is. And you can kind of just go through it and try to find things that look specifically interesting to you. Because there's going to be a lot of people publishing on a lot of different elements of it. You might see something, and also another great way to find sources is with the source you already started with, right? So like any given source you're going to pull is going to have, 20 to 100 different articles that they've probably read to write that article. And any of those would probably work too. Do you guys know how to enter library loan here? I'll show you that real quick. So, if you go to the library, or you go to the Benedictine website, just going to go to the library because it pops up. But you don't have to go to the library, you can just go to the main page and hit enter. interlibrary loan. Right? And all you're going to do is email what you found. So if there's an article you want and we don't have it, that's where you go and get it. Okay, another great place to search for scholarly sources is going to be Google Scholar. This one's going to be an extra step, right? So and so here you get often. These are books, right? Sometimes they'll have full PDFs. You can just open up the article. Sometimes they're going to have, I hate using two screens. Sometimes they'll have full PDFs. Sometimes they won't. If they don't, once again, you can just send that page right through interlibrary loan and be like, I want this article, and they'll get it for you. So that's probably the best way to go about it on our system. So, any questions on that? Yeah.
So like with this, like how do you know if it's in like okay articles to use?
Well, I mean, a lot of times this is going to sound funny, but it's going to be like what the title is. So in Google Scholar, if you look here, right, like a lot of times it'll tell you if it's a journal. So like, you know, this is the American Public Health Association journal, right? These are actually, like generally speaking, like if something presents itself as a scholarly publication, it probably is. Because there's no money to be made and no gain really in trying to fake that, because who's going to go out and be like, I'm going to pay for fake journal articles online, right? Like nobody, right? So like quite literally, like a lot of this is going to, generally speaking, be good sources. Unless you like open it up and it seems like something fake, you know, then maybe, right? But generally speaking, you can kind of do it by feel. But yeah, nobody's going to pawn themselves off as, I don't know, the journal. And often, like, if you've opened enough of these pages, you'll kind of get a feel of like, there's only like a handful of publishers that usually do academic journals, and their websites all look the same too. So like, as you move along, like maybe this is a better tool to develop over time using Google Scholar, but you can kind of just get a feel for it. Okay, while we're on the topic of good sources, do you guys know how to tell if a book is a good book or not to use? This is a really simple trick. It has mostly to do with the publisher. So like, if we were to look at, if we go back to our list, and I'll let you count any book because this is just, now I'm just being nerdy and like, so let's take a look at books. Undo the articles. Because not all books are created equal, right? So, a good example. Let's take a look at, see who made this. Okay, so what you're really going to look for is like the creme de la creme of books will usually be printed with university presses. So this is not one of them, right? And they'll literally be boring names like Oxford University Press, New Hampshire University Press, right? Kansas University Press. These are peer-reviewed just like journal articles are. And they're usually like, those are going to be your highest quality books. From there, it gets a little fuzzy. Non-profit text, and there's no way of knowing these, but when you get into your discipline, you'll know what they are, which ones are popular in your own field. Non-profit presses are better than for-profit presses. And for-profit presses are generally making the least scholarly publications in terms of books. Once again, I'll let you count any book, but generally speaking, that's kind of how it works. So, like in our own discipline, the non-profit press you see a lot is like Verso or Routledge. And they're very common, right? They're nonprofits, they're not affiliated with the university, but they have the same kind of standards. They have nothing to gain from it because they're a nonprofit organization. So, where this is an incorporated company, so this is probably not quite as high of quality publication, which is more that it just won't have as much good information for you than anything else. It's going to be less detailed. Okay. This is just general advice on doing research. Sorry if I went into more detail than probably was necessary. Any questions or thoughts on this? You guys got an idea of the term paper? Got an idea of what you're going to have to do? Later on, we're going to have you do a literature review. That's when you're going to collect all of your texts. So I'm going to have a chance to give you feedback on those. Once again, like, it's not going to be like, oh, you did the wrong kind of text, 10 points off. Like, that's not really the point of it. I'm going to instead kind of just, as long as you followed the guidelines, tried to get as many good sources, I'll give you feedback on whether they are good sources or not good sources, as well as if you're getting too broad, getting too narrow for what you're doing, right? So there'll be a lot more steps to come. Okay. Cool. Any questions so far? Let's talk about.
Hello. Unfortunately, we had technical difficulties in class today with the camera, so it shut off shortly after I finished my explanation of the project. So I've melded this video together. Basically adding this on as an explanation of what you missed. So today we talked about Arent, and in particular what we're focusing on is the origins of racism. Hannah Arendt's basic argument is that racism doesn't have its origins in sort of like the tradition of European thought or something like that, how we often want to talk about it, but instead has its origins in a very specific experience which created a need for it. And that experience has to do with colonialism. So colonialism, sometimes it's also called imperialism. There's a slight difference between the two, but all imperialism is essentially just colonialism. So what that essentially is essentially a period of where there's intensive resource extraction from other countries via military power. So Europe sends people abroad. Those people often suppress the population, the indigenous population of that place, with the whole goal of extracting resources from it and bringing it back to Europe. Another way to put it is colonization is this period starting in 1400, ending in the 1950s, that essentially sets up the growth of Europe as a wealthy place as well as North America. Which means that quite literally the wealth of North America and Europe is built off of these policies, which are specifically kind of policies of slavery and genocide. So as people went out into, and I gave examples of this coming from Mesoamerica and the Spanish invading Mesoamerica, as well as what's called in the Hannah Arendt article, the scramble for Africa, in which the European powers took over Africa. That's where a lot of your examples of colonialism come from. And they found, and so what Arendt specifically finds is that the brutality of that system, right, which initially happens before the creation of race, is what creates its necessity. So where otherwise the idea of racial inequality, in this case, racial inequality or racism is specifically meaning a theory of other people that's embedded within biological difference, which makes it different from the other forms of difference we looked at last week, which didn't embed it inside of people's biology, which meant that also like people were changeable. Right, they could morph and change and alter into something else, so that there was never this sort of like stringent removal of people from the system, which is what you get in colonialism. So in colonialism, you get the idea that people are racially inferior, biologically inferior, and that grows out of the experience of, well, to be frank, like the experience of regularly committing violence against them. The three examples that Hannah Arendt really focuses in on are South Africa, the United States, and India, all of which are sort of English-speaking colonies, which means that they practiced something called settler colonialism, where they brought populations from Europe to the colonies, right, with the idea of having them be a part of the resource extraction, having them doing the work to extract resources, which put them in conflict with indigenous populations. So that results in exactly the kind of things that we saw in North America, in Mesoamerica and in South America, where quite literally, like, the population of Native Americans is killed off. It's a genocidal act, which continues clean through into the 19th century with things like Manifest Destiny and our expansion out west. So basically what you get is you get that experience, right, guiding and altering how we view people and constructing this sort of system of racism. Now, as we'll see and as we talked about today, racism is not specifically people being racist, right? It is an institution, a system in place. So we're going to see much throughout the remainder of the semester how our current system, our current institutions are built off of, right, are born out of this experience, right, the experience of enslaving people in North America and treating them exceptionally poorly, right, with acts of violence, extreme acts of violence, as well as the acts of violence that we committed against Native Americans in South Africa, against the indigenous populations, right, et cetera, et cetera. So, in other words, briefly stated, Hannah Arendt is interested in how colonialism shapes our way of thinking about otherness, our way of thinking about other people, and that's really where race comes from as an idea. So race doesn't, as we talked about before, have these long historical roots dating back to antiquity. Instead, it's a relatively recent phenomenon, right? Mostly happening, really solidifying in the 18th and 19th centuries, and is born out of the experience of the subjugation of most of the world by Europe. So we'll continue on with very similar conversations, interconnected conversations, but that's sort of like the brief explanation of Hannah Arendt. If you have any further questions, let me know. Thank you. Bye.